Penn's Village is a community-based membership organization in central Philadelphia. It offers programs that bring active older adults together to socialize, inform, and educate, and encourages connection and engagement with neighbors. If members need additional assistance to help them stay in their homes as long as they are able, services by volunteers are offered. These include companionship, driving to medical appointments and local shopping, computer assistance, small household repairs, and more. In-person programs and services are restricted during COVID, but they will resume as soon as safety precautions allow. Learn more about us at www.pennsvillage.org.
Welcome. I'm Mark Raymond. I'm on the program committee, and today we have Dr. Jay Pomerantz. The program is called Aging as a Treatable Disease, Controlling Age-Related Diseases, Increasing the Healthspan. Dr. Pomerantz received his bachelor's degree from Hamilton College and an MD from the Yale University School of Medicine. He is a Distinguished Life Fellow of the American Psychiatric Association and winner of the Outstanding Psychiatrist Award of the Massachusetts Psychiatric Association in 2000. Since retiring from psychiatric practice, Dr. Pomerantz has been teaching at Ollie Temple University. Among the courses he has taught are neuroscience of memory, genes and stem cells, and the immunological approach to cancer treatment. And here's some really good news. He has a new book available from Amazon, and it's entitled A Happy End of Life, Living Well After 80. So please visit Amazon and purchase the book. Dr. Pomerantz, I turn it over to you.
As you heard, I'm a psychiatrist, and here I am presenting some material about aging as a treatable disease. Now, how did I get from 45 or almost 50 years of practice to talking about what is somewhat of a different area? It's not just psychiatry, obviously. And the book is actually, and I see that my co-author, Wolfgang Harms, is on the, welcome, Wolfgang. And here's just a look of the book. And in fact, what happened is Wolfgang gave me a manuscript of his experiences as a successful octogenarian, and he asked me to look at it. We know each other from playing tennis over several years. And I looked at it and I said, it's good, except that you left out something. He said, what's that? I said, you left out the brain, the aging brain. And so he said, well, can you write that? And I said, yeah, I'll try. And so I wrote the second half of the book, and we collaborated back and forth a lot. And that was a transition already, since I'm talking about and thinking about and researching the aging brain. I began to think about aging in general, and that led me to a large exploration of videos and research papers about the aging brain. And that's about aging in general, aging as a disease, and what we can do about it. And let me just make a couple of preliminary remarks about that before we go to the three videos, which are basically the meat of this presentation. I also want to say that this is the first of four. The second one is another look at across the board aging and at a cellular level. It's a little bit more scientific. It isn't meant that you need to have any science or medical background at all. The videos are pretty clear. And the third session will have to do with sleep, which is very important in preventing the bad effects of aging. And the fourth session is exercise, which is about as close to what you can do to stop aging or even reset yourself a little bit. So The other thing I wanted to tell you is that you should think about a word called hormesis. That's not a common word. I didn't know about it until I got into this stuff. Hormesis is how an organism responds to mild to moderate stress. And unlike a car, if you bang your car moderately, you have a moderate bang and it doesn't fix itself. In a biological organism, even plant or animal, and certainly human, if you stress that organism, for example, you don't eat much, you go on a fast, or you exercise periodically a lot, that causes a reset and a response in the organism to overcome it. For example, we're familiar with that. Exercise causes bigger muscles. At first, the muscle feels tired and weak and then grows. So the question is, as we think about aging, is there something that we can do hormetically to stress ourselves without doing real harm that will then end up as being overall beneficial? So just keep that in mind. It'll be easier if you see the videos. They explain things way better than I will, but I'll try to handle the questions and conversation after.
Which is the leading research institution in the world based in Novato in California. Eric is at the forefront of so many technologies that he's going to speak about now, including the senolytic drugs that I was describing earlier on, and it's my pleasure to introduce Eric Verdon.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Jim and Andrew, for the opportunity to address this audience and to participate in this day. Could not be more excited to be here and to spread what we think is a bit of a gospel. So I am not, for those of you who know me will realize that I'm not inclined to prophetic statements, but I will start with one. And this decade, I predict that this decade will be regarded as a historical inflection point for aging research. And the fact that this meeting, this foundation is actually being set up right now is a good example of this. And this is both from a societal and a scientific point of view. So the rest of this presentation will be focusing on these two key aspects. We've heard from our first presentation that we are in a rapidly aging society. And I never tire of showing this slide, even though Laura started with this also. Every decade for the last 140 years, we've gained 2 years of life expectancy. So this is absolutely a remarkable achievement. As we've heard also from other speakers this morning, no one knows where we will go in the future. And, oops, I'm sorry. And so I will not join the debate in terms of whether we're going to live in 98. No one truly knows. Science is clearly accelerating at a clip that has been unseen thus far. However, this picture, as was alluded to earlier, also does not reflect the full truth of what a rapidly aging population is today. In orange here, I'm showing you that this rapidly growing population is associated with a rapidly growing burden of diseases. In fact, by the time people reach 65 years old, on average, close to 80% carry at least one chronic disease of aging, and I'll be defining these in a few minutes. So many of us actually associate the aging process with disease, frailty, and disability. And so there's a good reason why we're doing this. It is actually the reality of many people who grow old. So these chronic diseases of aging are listed here, and you will recognize many of them because we actually have an epidemic of these conditions in the US and in most of the Western world. And they include atherosclerosis, heart attack, stroke, glaucoma, macular degeneration, cancer, osteoarthritis, osteoporosis, hip replacements, hearing loss, sarcopenia, Alzheimer and Parkinson, and type 2 diabetes, and others. And the data is actually quite remarkable because age is really associated with a logarithmic and exponential acceleration of the development of these diseases. If you look on the y-axis here, the death per 100,000 per year, and as a function of age, you can see that all of these diseases raised exponentially as we grow older. Now, this is in contrast to the way medicine is administered today. And I've depicted this image of a silo that illustrates the fact that every one of these diseases that I've just shown you is driven as the strongest risk factor by your age, and the aging process is actually treated as an individual condition. If you have a heart disease or a stroke, you go see your heart doctor. He will be taking care, preventing your heart disease. We have a series of interventions such as statins, such as diet, exercise, stopping smoking, exercising, and so on, that have resulted in a really dramatic decrease in the rates of heart disease and stroke. So people live 2 years longer and eventually develop a cancer. As we've heard from Jim, there are rapid development in cancer treatment today, immunotherapy. However, it's been estimated if we were to cure all cancers today, life expectancy would increase by 2 years. And the reason is that once you've been cured from your cancer, you go on to develop Parkinson's disease or Alzheimer's disease. So the way medicine is administered and thought of today is in this highly siloed organization does not take into account that the major driver of all of these diseases that are highlighted on the slides are driven by aging. And one reason why this hasn't been paid attention is because until recently, we thought that aging was not a variable that we could interact with or modify. So out of this came the geroscience concept, which originated from Gordon Lithgow at the Buck Institute a number of years ago. And this is the idea that we might be able to cure the chronic disease of aging by focusing on aging itself. Now, this seemed at that time a pretty radical idea, and I can tell you that from the medical standpoint, from the medical world, which is based and structured financially and culturally on these silos, it is still a radical idea. However, we're making inroads. So our goal at the Buck Institute in the immediate future, which is, as I described, the one that we can impact on, is to actually really change the trajectory that's shown here, is to increase what we call the health span, and make people live better, not only longer, but also live better longer. So you've heard about aging, and this is a term that is being tossed around in a very sort of easy way. We all think we know what aging is. However, the science of aging is still in its infancy. And this is what I want to spend a few minutes in trying to address. Really, what is aging, and can we change it? So in this picture that I'm showing you, a 1940 pickup truck, intuitively, you don't need a medical doctor or any kind of training to recognize this is an old truck. It is old, its wheels are busted, it is rusty, it's been left in a barnyard unoccupied. It is actually 78 years old, 1940. This truck is exactly the same age. And so here comes a change in your thinking. What you thought was old is actually not old, and the difference between these two trucks is one was in the hands of a collector who has very carefully maintained it and replaced every single pieces as it became old or disabled. In effect, this truck the truck on the right is exactly the same age as the one on the left, but it has a different biological age. And this is here comes a concept that the field describes as we all have a chronological age, which is the number of years that we've lived, but we all have a different biological age. And among your friends, if you are getting to be around 60 or 70, you probably know some people who have aged better than others. And so there is incredible variability in the trajectory of how we individually live. And these trajectories are actually highly predictive of how long and how well people will end up living. So our key understanding is trying to study what are the mechanisms that underlie these different trajectories between people. In the case of the car, this was a collector. In the case of us, the science is emerging, showing that aging is a failure of maintenance and repair. Just as for the truck, as the collector was replacing and repairing, we have built in ourselves a number of repairing and maintenance systems. These systems actually are at play throughout your life. We are not aware of this, most of us are not aware of this, but your skin turns over every 20 days, your bone turns over every few years. So pretty much every cell in our organism is turned over, fixed, and repaired. Our DNA is being repaired on a constant basis. And so there's evidence that a lot of the pathways that we are looking for that are able to modulate the rate of aging, actually an activation of these repair and maintenance program. And so 20 years ago, when the Buck Institute was founded, on the heels of a few discoveries that really changed our way of thinking about aging. People had always wondered, can we actually activate repair and maintenance program? And the answer is, yes, we can. So, first experiment among a group of scientists who really changed the way we were thinking about aging is the work of Cynthia Kenyon, a colleague of mine at UCSF in San Francisco, who was among the first to identify single mutations that it could actually change the rate of aging. And so this experiment was done in a little tiny worm. It's shown here. It's about the size of a comma on the right side there. It is called C. elegans because it is very elegant the way it threads its way through Petri dishes. It lives 20 days, which might seem crazy to actually study such a short-lived animal and to think that this might have any implications on human living, but I will show you how it does. And what Cynthia was able to show is that a single mutation in a gene called DAF2 doubled its lifespan. Really remarkable finding at that time, but not quite as remarkable as what she did as the next experiment, which was the removal of the gonads. Gonads, for those of you who are not scientific, are the sexual organs. And when I talk about this, I usually see people squirming in their chairs, so just wanted you to be aware this is not something we're considering for humans. But the remarkable finding is now this worm lived 10 times as long. And so what this data actually highlighted in a way that really inflamed the public and the scientists' imagination is this incredible life potential that was essentially hidden in this worm and could be unleashed. Now, one thing that has emerged in recent past is that this incredible plasticity or life potential that happens in the worm is unlikely, although I hate to say this because it makes me look like a pessimist and a curmudgeon, is unlikely to happen in humans, because what we have seen is that the closer we move in the evolutionary tree, the harder it is to increase lifespan. However, we believe that in most animal species, there is a potential for a really significant increase in lifespan. So one thing to note also, this is a mutation in a gene. So a single mutation out of a genome that has 100 billion base pair, one mutation causes this. We're not about to enter mutations in the human population. This is actually one of the taboo areas. No one is thinking about doing this. So the next question is, can we actually identify environmental modifications that are able to modulate lifespan? And believe it or not, this is an experiment that was conducted in the 1930s by Clive Mackay, Rockefeller University at the time, and showing that you could actually do something pretty dramatic in terms of lifespan in rats and in mice, and it's since been shown in pretty much every species in which it has been tested, including in primates, recently in marmoset, is that by restricting the calorie intake, simply decreasing the amount of food that an animal eats, you can also dramatically increase lifespan. Again, I'm showing you a life curve. So we're starting with 100 animals. Normal mice live about 3 years, 36 months. You restrict, so these mice are eating as much as they want. You now calculate this amount and you say, you put mice in another cage and you restrict this amount by 25%. Their lifespan increases by 10%. Up to 55, 65%, you can see more than 50% increase in lifespan. Now, mice are much closer to us. And actually in the marmoset, the primate in which calorie restriction was tested, it increased lifespan up to 20 and 30%. So remarkable finding with relevance to humans. Now, obviously, if you continue calorie restriction, you end up in malnutrition. There's a fine balance to be struck there. However, this study really highlighted again, even in mammals, an incredible life potential and vitality potential. So scientists have been busy trying to understand what is the molecular underpinning for these changes. And I'm showing you here a summary of work trying to map the pathways between calorie restriction and increased lifespan. Now, I should say also, when lifespan increases under calorie restriction, we've also been able to show that health span increases as well. So these mice are not living only longer, they're living better and more healthy, which is exactly what we're trying to focus on at this time. So a number of things have been identified. The graph is complicated. I want you to point two really critical aspects. One is that these pathways, these genes, for example, TOR is one that will come back in the discussion because this is the target for which we have drugs that are actually in the clinic today in humans and could potentially be used in the future. So TOR, for example, is conserved across species going from C. elegans and mammals. And this is something that no one could have predicted, that by studying this little lowly worm, we might be able to identify players that actually are conserved in mammals all the way to humans. The same goes for insulin signaling right here, which is one of the major pathways associated with aging. This is the work in large part of Linda Partridge, actually one of your most famous scientists here in England. So incredible amount of detailed knowledge, and this science is continuing to emerge. Today we have identified more than 800 genes that actually are able to modulate lifespan in C. elegans. So what we thought at first was the exception. I should say before the work of Cynthia Kenyon, people thought that aging was caused by so many genes that you could actually never interfere with the process. And the identification of a single gene that could have such dramatic effect was really changing the whole field and led to the funding of the Buck Institute, where I work in 1999. Just a little bit of a sort of shameless self-promotion. We were the first freestanding research institute focused on the biology of aging. Today we have 200 employees from over 30 different countries, so we're a not-for-profit research institute. Our mission is to end the threat of age-related diseases, and we have a beautiful IMP-built campus, 250,000 square foot, just north of San Francisco, so come to visit if you are in the Bay Area. And we've created the first PhD program in the biology of aging. And to finish, I want to briefly discuss, if I have a few more minutes, a story that Jim alluded to. This is the story of senolytics. So this is our faculty. We have 20 faculty members. And the story I'm going to tell you for a minute was built by Judy Campisi, one of our scientists, and it relates to cell senescence and aging. So this is a normal mouse aging. This is the same mouse at about the equivalent of 60 years old, and it has by that time accumulated a number of abnormal cells that we call senescent cells. These senescent cells accumulate in all of us, starting at age 20 to 25, and they grow in number during aging. We used to think they were an anti-cancer mechanism because this is a way that the cells respond when they detect that they might become cancerous. However, what has emerged is that they are actually secreting what we call the SASP. This is the work of Judy Campisi. These SASP are mediators that lead to chronic inflammation. It turns out that chronic inflammation is one of the major pathways that drives all of these chronic diseases of aging. You've seen the slide from Jim already. I'll show it again. This is the mouse, a normal aged mouse. It suffers all kinds of debilitating conditions. This is the same mouse that has undergone senolytic therapy. It lives 35% longer and has also a dramatic extension of health span. It has lost all of these manifestations of aging. Great promise. Based on this, Judy and a serial entrepreneur called Ned David and Jan van Dersen at the Mayo Clinic started a company called Unity, which is really, we believe, will be one of the key turning points in the whole landscape of commercial development in the aging space. So Unity was launched at the Buck in 2011. They initially raised $170 million. Their IPO was in May 2018. They have a current market cap of $500 million. They've started amazingly enough, and this really illustrates the dramatic acceleration that we see in the field. After being in existence for 7 years, they entered the clinic in July 2018 for the treatment of knee osteoarthritis. Now, the second remarkable thing is that the same drug that is being used for knee osteoarthritis will next enter clinical trials for glaucoma, an eye disease. And I think this really speaks to what the aging field is going to be doing. So I get asked quite often, what can I do today? My nightmare vision of what the Buck Institute will do, and this is my last slide, is to create drugs that will allow people to not exercise and eat anything they want and create a generation or a country of couch potatoes. So I think all of these interventions are being studied, and many of them will actually change the course of life expectancy in the future. My favorite is exercise. 40% decrease all around mortality, decreased cancer, decreased cardiovascular, decreased diabetes. The more exercise you do, the better. So this is, if this were a pill, this would be a multi-billion-dollar pill. So it's never too late to start. We actually are studying how exercises modulate the aging pathway. I will stop here, and I want to thank you for your attention.
Okay. Incidentally, I wouldn't buy Unity stock. It's dropped 2/3 in its value from, I think, 18 to 6. It's failed the knee osteoarthritis trials, but they are continuing on with a glaucoma effort. People have some questions that in the chat perhaps that I could answer.
What levels of exercise have this therapeutic effect, to put it in layman's terms?
Sure.
And I don't know if you're going to cover that in future discussions or not.
Yes, actually our 4th session, the final session, is devoted just to exercise because it's that important. Just as a quick answer, about 150 minutes a week of moderate exercise, and we'll get into more of that later. What does that mean? It means sort of brisk walking, where you could still talk. If you're walking with somebody else or through a mask, you could still talk. And it applies to both aerobic exercise and strength training, but we have a whole 4th session devoted to exercise.
And I think we've got someone who hopes that when you're talking about that, you've got suggestions for when both it's cold outside and also in the age of a pandemic when you can't go to a gym or an exercise class, how we can exercise and stay healthy.
Well, one of the things, I live in a condo, it's 25 stories, and there are 2 escape stairwells that no one else uses except me. And I will go down and then up, stopping every couple of floors. Maybe 10 flights is enough for me, in addition to a walk. As I see several of my tennis player friends, we're still playing outside, many of us, even in December. So there are things one can do, bicycle riding. If you're lucky enough to have a small gym, perhaps in a building, or you can limit it to one person or one family group at a time, and then put an air filter in, which is what we've done in our building. So that's another possibility. Walking is probably the mainstay at this point, and that's sufficient. And if you get little barbells, or I'm a little reluctant to suggest things like I used to do when I was young, the U.S. Air Force calisthenics book. I think if I try to do any of that now, I'd probably end up in the hospital. And that's probably true for many of us. So.
Several of the audience members have referred to the last slide and not being, was the last slide the areas that the bubbles, and they weren't able to read what those areas of investigation were.
Oh, he talked about, there were several charts, and he talked about a medicine that was possible. That's rapamycin, actually, and the TOR, T-O-R, is target of rapamycin. You could all look that up in Google. It turns out that is one of the drugs they're working on. I wouldn't at this point recommend it. It is an approved drug. It's useful for organ transplants to prevent reactions to rejection. And interestingly enough, it is one of these hormetic drugs that challenges us. So it has to be pulsed. So it's not exactly benign. In our second video, there's another pathway, and that's the metformin. Metformin is an anti-diabetic type 2 drug that is quite safe. And there's some question about utilizing that or not. And that's the third video, is actually talks a little more about who should use it or who shouldn't use it. Yeah.
People wanted to know specifically the slide that talked about what we can do today, and they were unable to read the specifics in the video.
What we can do today is exercise, some degree of calorie modification. There's also a whole other issue of timing of when one eats. There's some evidence that if you skip breakfast, for example, and don't eat snacks, that you get some extra, again, benefit. You're stressing your body a little bit. Also fasting, 1 or 2 day water only fast. Probably if you're over 70, that might not be the world's best idea. I would do it maybe 1 day at most, 4 times a year or something. So exercise, keeping thin, and especially it's movement. It's not just exercise. It's sitting and lying down for most of the day is not good. So any kind of exercise that you can get up and around is good. Now, the thing that we'll be focusing on, which is a matter of research and maybe closer than we think, are a couple of drugs. So metformin will be the first one we're going to look at today. Should we go on to that then?
You should know that most people who wear skirts live 3 years longer than people who don't live skirt. Now, truly, the statistic includes women, okay? But this is huge, guys. Lifespan that is 3 years longer. You know, in my community, when they ask, why husbands die before their wives, the answer is because they want to, okay? But that's another TED Talk. Thank you so much. But I'm here not to talk about science fiction. In fact, just to update you about science now. And, you can look, and I've looked throughout this day. By the way, people have aged earlier, I see, and left. But I looked throughout the day at this auditorium, and I was asking, and I'm a physician, I was asking, who here has hypertension? Who here has diabetes? Who here has high cholesterol? And I wouldn't be doing a good guess. But if I ask who's here over the age of 50 or who's below age of 50, all of us will do a pretty good job. And the point is that aging has a biology. And this biology can be targeted. We can delay aging. We can stop aging. We can reverse aging in several instances. And this is what I want to talk with you about today, and also to make sure that you understand that there are benefits from that. But before the benefits, let me make several points. The first is that aging is the risk factor for most of those diseases that we are afraid of, from cancer, from heart, from Alzheimer, from diabetes. Now, you'll tell me, no, just a minute, cholesterol is the biggest risk factor for heart. Cholesterol is a threefold risk factor for heart. But death from heart disease is 1,000 times higher when we age. This is the major risk factor for heart. And aging is the major risk factor for Alzheimer, diabetes, and cancer. And the point here is that aging, or the biology of aging, is drive those diseases. So we need to stop the aging part in order to prevent all those diseases. What's happening now is terrible, because if you look at accumulation of 3 diseases, okay, we're talking about multiple diseases, and this graph shows accumulation of 3 diseases in men and women on the left. It's not much when we're young, and after age of 60, it takes off. It goes from 0 to 230. So people have 3 diseases. Each disease might be terrible. Each disease has a treatment that has side effects. And then you have 3 treatments that all are interacting with each other. We cannot go on and live like that. And there is a clear alternative for that. What we need to do is start targeting aging so that we can actually drop down this accelerated rate of getting a disease. How are we going to do that? Well, first of all, the question is it worthwhile doing that? Is there an example that will make you think that maybe it's worthwhile doing? Here is the Kahn family, because the Kahn family is the poster child of one of my studies, that is studies on centenarians. And you see the Kahn sibling, they are all born between 1910 and 1920 to 2 parents. And what's unique about them is each one of them got to be older than 102. Helen, who's sitting in the left, that died at age 110, I met her when she was 100 years old. In fact, she opened the door to me smoking a cigarette. And I'm looking at her, and I'm saying, excuse me, none of your doctor told you to stop smoking? And she looks back at me and says, you know, all 4 doctors that told me to stop smoking, they died. And I think she's making a very important point. Point 1 is, if you smoke for 90 years, you can live for long life. Okay, but really the point here is that those guys were resistance or were resilience to some of the insults that we know will kill each one of us. And by the way, I have more than 700 centenarians, and half of them are overweight or obese, half of them are smokers, less than half do exercise, like even walking or bicycling. Only 2% are vegetarian. They got to this age in spite of the environment. And I'm certainly not telling every one of you that the secret for longevity is to be obese and smoke and anything like that. As I said, I have over 700 centenarians. We actually have 3,000 people because we have the offspring of centenarians too, and we learn really a lot about them. In fact, we found longevity genes that have been translated into treatment by major pharmaceuticals. So this is a really good avenue of understanding them. But I'll ask you, do you want your family to be a family like that? But first I have to convince you something that I found out people do not understand intuitively. The question is, did they get sick when everybody else got sick, and now they live 30 years longer, but they are sick? Or did their longevity and health span go together? In other words, did they age slower, or did they just happen to survive? This is the answer. So what you see here is a different graph than before. You see on the left side, which is the disease-free side, the 1 represent all of them are healthy. Now the green line is our control population, And the blue line is our centenarian. So let's look at the green line. You see that people are healthy, and kind of after the age of 60, they start to have diseases. At age 80, less than 10% don't have any disease. But look at the centenarians. They get disease later on. In fact, they open 20, 30 years of disease-free time. And even after the age of 100, almost 30% of them don't have a disease. They die one day. So their health span and lifespan is going together, and that's why when you talk to the Khan family, who are 100 years old, they're all having fun because they're healthy. Okay, so they can do anything if you're healthy. But this is, for me, not the major discovery. The major discovery here is not only they live longer, but they are sick for very little time at the end of their life. We called it contraction of morbidity. So if all of us are sick 5 years at the end of their life, they are sick less than 5 months at the end of their lives. It's interesting that it's not only in my study, the CDC, the Central of Disease Control, is doing lots of interesting calculation. In this case, they were looking at the medical cost in the last 2 years of life of somebody who dies after 100 or at age 70. So to die at age 100 is third the cost of somebody who dies when they are 70. This led to this calculation of what happened if we have increased health span and contraction of morbidity. It's a 7 trillion save for the economy. We called it longevity dividend. And this is actually the point that we're trying, and I'm going all over the world to teach, to really tell politicians that we cannot afford not to do it when we are increasing health span by decreasing all diseases, not only one. We're doing a major save for the economy. So how do we do it? What knowledge do we have where we can start making progress? We created this whole field that's called geroscience. It's kind of interesting that the science on old people is really new. What we've achieved in geroscience, we have identified hallmarks of aging that can be targets for therapy. There are 8 hallmarks of aging that we found, and actually each one of those hallmarks has a target that a biotech company is trying to develop drugs to. But the most important thing about those hallmarks are they're interactive. So for example, in the bottom you see proteostasis. So our cells are failing to do garbage disposal. We start accumulating lots of garbage. We can correct this by genetic manipulation. We can also correct it now with a drug. And when we do that, it's not only that we solve proteostasis, but this affects the metabolic dysregulation that we have with aging, inflammation, mitochondrial problem. So it affects other parts of the hallmarks. And I have many more examples like that. I think each one of the hallmarks can be a TED Talk on its own. How did we get there? Well, we did something kind of clever. Instead of just understanding the aging that sounds so complex, we created and found by accident or by design models that live longer. By looking at models that live longer, we understood some of what's going on in aging, even if we didn't understand the whole of aging. And we started creating a whole industry of science and biotechs that will target those. And I will summarize what we achieved in those 2 sentences. First of all, healthy, health span and lifespan. And health span is really my goal. I have to tell you, in this advertisement for a drug that delay aging, I would put the lifespan as a side effect, okay? You know, you can live without diseases and stuff like that, but I'm sorry, you might live longer. I don't know if you're ready for that. I don't know if your economy will allow that. But this is a side effect. But the point is, health span has been extended in numerous models. And it was done by manipulation with the environment and with drugs and with genetic ways. Not only that, and that's the second point, some of those drugs are in humans' use, except they're not purpose for targeting aging. So how do we make a progress? What are the challenges in order to bring these discoveries and start getting to delay aging right now? This is our problem. If you have hypertension, or if we want to treat diabetes, or if we want to treat any one of the other diseases, there's biological discoveries, and biotechs are formed. Maybe the pharmaceuticals are then charging too much money, but there's a drug that's being developed and eventually will get cheaper. Okay, and that's how we do it all the time. We have a major problem that FDA doesn't recognize aging as a prevented disease, or as we say, doesn't have an indication. If aging is not recognized as a preventable disease, two things are going to happen. First of all, the healthcare providers don't have to pay the customers. They should if they do the economy, but they don't have to. But more important, the pharmaceuticals are not going to jump in where you don't have an economical plan. So one of our obstacles now is to actually get the FDA to approve aging as a preventable condition. How are we doing it? Well, we're a bunch of scientists that created this study that's called TAME. TAME stands for Targeting Aging with Metformin. Metformin is a common drug to treat type 2 diabetes, and it's a generic and cheap drug. In fact, metformin is the cheapest drug in a formulary in the United States. Still 10 times more expensive than in Canada, but it's really cheap. Why metformin? Well, when you give metformin to a variety of animals, they will live longer and healthier. And there's a lot of biology. In fact, metformin hits most of the hallmarks of aging, whether it's primary or secondary. But also, there are lots of clinical studies that shows that metformin prevents type 2 diabetes. It prevents heart disease in diabetics. It's associated with less cancers in diabetes. It delays cognitive decline in Alzheimer's patient or MCI patient. It even has lower mortality. People on metformin with diabetes die significantly less than people without diabetes. Even if they have diabetes and they're more obese and they have more disease to start with, metformin prevents this mortality. So there's a lot of data, clinical data, to support that metformin is a drug that we can repurpose for aging. So what we're trying to do is two things. Use metformin as a tool, and I'm saying it like that because it's a tool in order to show that aging can be targeted. Even more important, use it so the FDA will have an indication to delay aging. And we've talked with the FDA, and we have a way to proceed. We hope to start the trial very soon. Let me make two closing remarks. And it has to do a little bit about the future also. If aliens were landing in Boston, who here has pets? Raise your hands. Yeah, I thought the people who had pets left already or didn't come. But more than half here have pets. So I think if aliens will come to Boston, and I have friends who have dogs in Boston, the first thing that they will try to figure out is who's running this world, the dog or the man, right? Because the dogs are pulling the man who's scooping the poops, you know. It'll take them 24 hours. But I think more important, they will look around and say, you didn't take care of aging? What's the matter with you? You didn't stop aging because remember, those people who come here came from farther than Mars. They already discovered what to do with it, because if we go to Mars and we don't have something that really targets the process of aging, we'll get cancer or heart disease by the time we're there, and we're never going to come back. So we need this for this reason. But that's not the only reason we need those drugs now. In this hospital, there are people who are surviving cancer that got immunotherapy, chemotherapy. Those drugs are aging those people. Those kids after cancer are aging rapidly, and everybody after severe chemotherapy and radiotherapy is aging rapidly. We need to help them. People with HIV get diseases 10 years before they should, according to age. Disabled people who cannot move and then they eat more, so they create other problem that accelerates aging. Or poor people that for variety of reason cannot get into medical. As I said, metformin is a really cheap drug to give to people to prevent all those diseases that are risky when you're poor. So we are not talking only about how to make your family, you help your family, but we're talking about other needs that when you target aging are very important. And I do want to make another point. It will sound more futuristic than it is, and I'm not talking about science fiction in anything that I said so far. But think of it this way. You can take a sperm of a 70-year-old man and fertilize the egg of a 50-year-old woman. And the baby will be formed, or what we see is this blastocyte that is being formed and dividing. And guess what? Those cells do not remember the age of the parents. They erase everything and starts at zero. We already, in this situation, created this erasing of aging. And this idea of doing it is already happening in the labs. So the future is about really improving the delaying aging to the extent that will be healthy, that we won't have to take care of our parents, but our parents will take care of us and our children. There's no science fiction here. This is science now. It's accelerating very rapidly, and I really hope that your aging will be real fun. Thank you.
In the interest of time, I think what I'm going to do is summarize the third video for you. It's very related to this second video about metformin. Before you all go over to your doctor and request metformin, not because you have type 2 diabetes, but because you want to avoid cancer, heart disease, type 2 diabetes, arthritis, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, etc., even COVID-19. COVID-19 is an age-related disorder. As you know, it's many more times lethal. It's 20% to get hospitalized if you're over age 70, as opposed to practically none if you're 20, and even a 10% lethality overall for people over 70. So it's as opposed to negligible in children. So it's another age-related disorder. And in fact, Dr. Barsily has recommended metformin for people as perhaps a preventative almost to see if that would work. And there's some trials about that, none conclusive. But before you go off to get your metformin, in the third video is a conversation with a neuroscientist who looked at this question and reframed it. Instead of saying, is metformin better than nothing? She said, how is metformin, we know it's better for diabetics, type 2 diabetes, that's clear, it's a first-line drug. But the question is, should people without diabetes take it? And what if you're thin and exercising? And the answer is, there's some studies about this, that in fact, metformin blocks some of the good effects of exercise. That if metformin will prevent across the board about 30% of the morbidity of these other illnesses, exercise itself without metformin does 70%. And however, if you take both exercise and metformin, instead of having an additive effect, it knocks it down closer to just the metformin effect. So if you're vigorously exercising, metformin is contraindicated for most things. It even blocks lean muscle mass augmentation. So if one is a couch potato, the advice probably is metformin is great. If you're really exercising and you're not overweight and you don't have type 2 diabetes, metformin is not necessarily a good idea. So this whole field is early and it's tricky. And in the next session, it's going to get even more interesting because there are some attempts to not only stop aging, but reset, perhaps even going backwards, if you will, at the cellular level. And this is done by serious Harvard scientists and many labs around the world. So this is a serious field, but it is not necessarily ready for prime time. So metformin depends upon one thing for sure, your level of physical activity and whether or not you have prediabetes or type 2 diabetes. So it's a tricky issue. And I would certainly talk it over and research it on your own some before going out and doing any of these things. But the science, I think, is coming along. Let me stop there, and now maybe we can get some more questions and have a little discussion.
What criteria are used to determine stages of aging that then allow you to correlate drug indications, dosages, efficacy, et cetera?
Thank you for that wonderful question. That is the topic of the next session. That's the biological clock. And I'll just give you a preview. There's something called epigenetics. Genes, you know, and we always think of genetics as involving DNA and genes. It also, in the last 20 years, more so now, involves epigenetics. Epigenetics control whether or not genes are turned on and off. And only if the genes are, so epigenetics is controlled by environmental factors, among other things, like smoking turns on bad genes and turns off good genes in general. So epigenetics, and there's something called an epigenetic clock, which you're going to hear about in session 2. And if you can do something to restore the epigenomic composition in each of your cells, it turns out as we get older, the cells lose some of the epigenetic information, and skin cells become muscle cells. They get confused. Nerve cells become muscle cells. They lose some of their ability to stay with the gene expression, which genes are on. Now, if you really think about it, we all come from each of your cells has the same chromosome, the same DNA, but they're not the same. A muscle cell isn't a skin cell, isn't a brain cell, isn't a neuron, etc. So they're different, and what controls it is the epigenome. And one way to think about the epigenome is that you need something like this because you have each chromosome is about 6 feet in length, and it's crammed into a microscopic or submicroscopic part of the nucleus of each individual cell has the same 6 feet. Now, the cell can't read the genes and what the genes are saying about producing protein all at the same time because it's all rolled up like in a scroll. So it has to move the scroll, and it's the epigenome which controls which part of the scroll is available to be read, i.e. which genes can be turned on and which are turned off. That in turn has everything to do with the clock. We're losing the timekeeper. We're losing the custodian of the gene, and which genes are turned on and off gets confused. And there's some possibility of even reversing that. But you're going to hear all about that session 2 next week. Long answer to a question.
But when was that TED talk?
These are all within the last year or
So,
two.
is there any or are you going to talk about that more next time in terms of updating the metformin studies and
the metformin,
FDA's?
the metformin study is currently being done. And the FDA is in collaboration with Nir Barzilai, and that's a very interesting study. And the point is very important, that you're looking at diseases differently. Instead of in a silo, let's say vertically, you're cutting across horizontally and you see different things. For example, I mentioned that COVID-19 is an age-associated illness. Well, we didn't look at it, we're not looking at it as an age-associated illness when we look at a vaccine. That vaccine is not going to help type 2 diabetes, is not going to help Alzheimer's. It's only going to help people with COVID. On the other hand, if you find something that cuts the other way, that looks across at age per se, as the epigenomic clock or metformin or rapamycin or exercise or dietary, partial dietary restriction, then you look at it at something quite different, and you get different answers. So it's, I think, important to ask the question both ways. What can I do about a particular disease? And what can I do about all the diseases that correlate so strongly? I mean, that figure about 1,000-time risk of heart disease with increasing age as opposed to increasing cholesterol. That really tells you all you need to know. And it's absolutely true, again, for cancer and Alzheimer's and et cetera, and Parkinson's.
A related question, if metformin reduces the amount of sugar released to the bloodstream, what if you didn't eat so much sugar? Would metformin be necessary?
There's studies showing that the restriction of sugar is helpful to some degree. High sugar not being good. You know, if you want carbohydrates, you want complex carbohydrates that are released slowly. So bombarding your system, you know, particularly, let's say in the evening before you go to sleep, so that you're, you know, eating 18 hours a day instead of 10 or 12, you're stressing your insulin production. And as we get older, we get less sensitive to insulin, our muscles and liver. So sugar is not your friend, which isn't to say that, and that's the whole other issue of diet. Diet's a whole big topic, which we're not going to have time for. If you take my Ali course, we'll spend 1 or 2 sessions on diet. But that's a whole complex issue. But in general, sugar is not great. And in general, there's some questions about the fatty type diet, which are ketogenic diet. If you want one simple, quick takeaway, it's the low-fat Mediterranean diet, which complex carbohydrates is probably the one I would recommend at this time. Other people would give you different answers.
Rebecca has a good question, which kind of ties some of the points made in both videos together. She's she's not quite clear on the notion of the $7 trillion savings that we heard about in the first video. If people are sick for a shorter time, Won't there be less need for medical care tests and medicines? I think what she's asking there is that will have its own impact on the economy, what we might call the medical industrial complex here in Philadelphia. And so is that, you know, there are losers and winners, if you will.
Let's look at that. So the issue is that people who live a long time die quickly. The longer you live, I think this is very encouraging personally. My mother lived to be 98, but the last few years of her life were not good. And but that's a little bit of the exception, and it wasn't all that long. Most people, so every day that one lives, one can say, oh, it's one less day to live. It's also one less day to possibly suffer with a bad disease. So you want to live to be 100, let's say, or maybe 90, and then have a very short period of time of suffering from one of these illnesses, which finally will get you, rather than be along with several diseases and they get you early. So it's better to die at 90 than at 70 by a lot, and even better to die at 100. And it's better for the cost saving, but we're looking not so much about, not too worried about the medical industrial complex. There'll be other things that we can use the money for, maybe to for research rather than to spend all the money on coronary artery bypasses. And if we could avoid that, that's what's characteristic. Here, I'll get on a soapbox for a moment. What characterizes the US healthcare system is huge expenditures for single diseases which buy you little time, except if you're that person, you'll take whatever you can get. But we spend a huge amount of money on specialized medicine and diagnostics, and we don't do a very good job about prevention, diet, exercise, poverty, fatty fast foods. Vegetables are, of course, a lot better for you than fatty red meat. Consequently, if you look at our longevity just as a simple thing, we're down in the middle to the end of the pack. Despite our huge expenditures, which are more than double of any other country, our actual life expectancy per capita is less. And that's also bifurcated in terms of the poor people versus the rich people, in terms of health style and also medical care. So I'm not mourning for the biomedical industry. They'll survive nicely. But for each of us personally, I'd rather live a long time, both to live a long time, as long as I don't get sick. And the real point is trying to avoid illness. And that's not, you're not going to avoid illness in the hospital. Even though you need to go if you're sick, you might avoid that particular episode. But dietary kinds of things, exercise in particular, there's many other things, proper sleep, we'll get into some of those. The healthier lifestyle will do you a lot better than many of the things. But they're working on the medicines and they're working on the miracles, and I want you to know about it. I think it's just interesting. It's also good for your brains, and another good thing you can do is exercise your brain and try to learn. So.
Your tennis partner, Wolfgang.
Yes.
Maybe this is just an easy shot for you. I don't know. He asks, in contraposition to finding life-extending drugs, kind of what can we do to prevent decay in the first place, such as identifying gene-damaging chemicals in food, in effluents, in pollution, and so forth, that would maybe obviate the need for the life-extending drugs.
Uh, well, now you get a picture of what that book was like writing, with Wolfgang and I going back and forth about these things. And it's hard. It's a very good idea to look for anything. You don't want lead in the water, in the paint. You don't want heavy metals. You don't want to have too many contaminated fish with mercury. So sure, the more you can do to prevent things, the better. However, can't prevent everything. And so you do the best you can with prevention. And surely every dollar spent on prevention is cheap compared to every dollar you spend on in kidney dialysis. That's for sure. So I think Wolfgang has a point.
Let's see, because we have a few more questions
Sure.
here.
One of the other things we could do is, if it's possible, maybe you can unmute somebody who has a question so that we can have a little bit more of a dialogue and I can understand the question.
We can do that.
Hi, I'm Paula. Oh, can I speak?
Sure.
I'm Paula, and there's been a lot of writing that recently about social interaction as being such an important part of reducing, the aging factor, not just going to classes, but communicating with people before and after. Is there science on that, or is there just common sense?
Loneliness. You're talking about that is also one of the sessions, and not in this course, but in the continuing part of it that I'm doing at Ollie. Loneliness is very important. And speaks to something I know a fair amount about, that social isolation leads to major depression. Major depression is the major risk factor for Alzheimer's, big factor. It is also increases in cardiovascular disease and in cancer. We are not meant to be alone. And so loneliness, especially as we get older, is a huge problem. And so that's why something like Penn's Village is so good, because it allows people to interact. When we don't have COVID, it can be in person. Being an island all by oneself is disaster. So the more we can be together, it's healthier. And the evidence is very, very high. So don't try to be out and be with people. Conversations. Zoom is good.
Go ahead, Miriam.
I understand what you're saying about loneliness. Unmute. But what about for those of us who like isolation and aren't all that sociable?
Well, so that's an interesting question. That I think, at least as I see it, goes to individual. People are different. And I'm talking in generalizations. And in fact, one of the, so if somebody's comfortable and somehow has just enough interaction, not everybody is a social butterfly. And if it works for them and they don't feel depressed or anxious, that's great. So I wouldn't, the other thing that disturbed me a little bit in the second video was with the centenarians. The centenarian and their bad health habits. One needs to understand that they have protective genes. And they're special, and there's not a lot of them. So I would stay away from their advice about smoking and eating, and there's always going to be the exceptions. They're exceptions. Now, the rest of us who don't have those protective specialized genes had best not to follow their bad practices. Again, I say that because of this great variability between people. And so some people would rather be alone and get enough out of it and maybe read a book and they feel accompanied by the characters in the book. It's fine, they talk to them. So everybody needs to do it in their own particular way, Miriam.
There's a question about our healthcare system and the refusal to wear masks. Do you see any correlation?
Oh, we have another hour and a half. So our healthcare, two different big things. You already heard. Let me start with masks. I'll put on my psychiatric hat. That is, there's always been, if you tell anybody anything, there's a part in each of us that wants to say no. And there's also a part in each of us that is unrealistic. We don't like the terms of being alive. And if somebody says you can flout those realistic things, you can eat as much as you want. You can be a couch potato. You don't have to wear a mask. You're safe. I do it. Look at me. Follow me. That's very appealing. It's charismatic, if you will. They're flying in the face of reason. And is it dangerous? Yeah, I think it's really dangerous. Masks are your best friend, not only for you, but the other people, but oneself as well. Especially as we're older. This is an older population I'm talking to. If you're 20, sure, it's, if you don't care about your grandparents and you don't have contact with them, I think it's possible to go out and flout it. You're not going to get very sick by and large. But if you're an older person, 10% death rate, worse than that, and another 10%. So a total of 20% in the hospital. And then there's what are called the long haulers, people who go on for months with pains and fogginess and a variety of exacerbations of their health, lung and brain problems. I think, can you get away with it? Sure. Occasionally, some people will. But I think it's really highly dangerous. Now, why people will do that, especially in this country, for better or worse, has a lot to do with selfishness. Now, that's also part of why we're dramatically productive. People will work better for themselves than they'll work for somebody else or for the collective. So it's, I don't want to get into communism versus capitalism, but, and especially leadership, I think is key. If you have leadership that's for one reason or another saying no masks, people want to hear that. It's popular. It may not be true. I'm sure it's terrible advice. So, and the establishment, I think the doctors, the nurses, the respiratory, anybody who's worked in a hospital is furious and upset. They're getting tired, sick themselves, and other people are coming into the hospital. And why are they there? Well, many times for good reason. They got it despite wearing a mask. But when people come in without masks, without distancing, without washing their hands, it's infuriating and very counterproductive to everybody, because then if you have a heart attack, will you get into the hospital? Who's there to take care of you in the ICU? Is there a bed? So it's a big, big problem. Much worse if you're older, I think. I think you can, if you're younger, you can maybe get by. The chances are you won't be hospitalized. and et cetera, et cetera. So it's, again, an age-related problem. And the interesting question from a scientific view is, what is it that happens to us that we're getting older, and by God, there's different stuff going on. It's not just a little weakness or forgetfulness. There's systemic issues that are worth investigating, and they just happen to be interesting. So enough about masks. Wear masks.
So there's a question about when our body wears out and falls apart. How do we stop that?
When it's already fallen apart is a big, big problem. Now you can try to put it back together again, I bet, but I'm sure some of it is just wearing out. And that's what we're going to talk about. The next session is the epigenetic possibilities for why that is. There are other theories. There's inflammation. But when it falls apart, what you do is you somehow cope. And the interesting thing is that most older people cope well. Actually, in the book, there's an interesting study that we report on, that older people are by and large happier than younger people. That there are two peaks for happiness. One is around age 17 or 18, and the next one is around 70 and above. So somehow, how do we do it? We're falling apart, but somehow, and the investigators followed up a little, asking people, why are you happy? I mean, is it you're well? And no, I have pain, but I'm still alive. And I'm better than my neighbor who's housebound, who can't get out of the wheelchair. So I have a cane. I'm doing well. I feel good. I get to see my grandchildren. And besides, I don't have too long to suffer. So we have a way of putting it into a positive perspective, again, statistically. Not to say that older people never get depressed. I'll tell you a little more about, just a quick thought about variability. In my psychiatric practice, I saw a man who came in at age 84 depressed. And what was he depressed about? He could no longer have good sex 4 times a week. He was down to twice a week. And his wife was mad at him, he said. She was also in her 80s. So people's variability is enormous, in contrast to a couple who I also treated in their 30s, who I scheduled a session for them, and they said, no, we can't come that day. It was out like 2 months. I said, why is that? And they both giggled. And I said, why? And then pursued it a little bit. It turns out that was the once a year they had sex, and they were in their 30s. So people's variability and how they deal with infirmity or not infirmity of one kind or another, sexual or otherwise, is extremely wide. So some people cope differently than other people, obviously. Great differences.
So we've gone our 90 minutes. Do we have some more questions? Do you want to stay and take them, or
sure.
Do you have to go?
Stay in. No, I don't have to go. So we start late, we'll end late.
Okay. What is the definition of hormesis?
Hormesis.
Hormesis.
Okay. So hormesis is sort of a complicated thing. It basically is that organisms respond to moderate threat by getting stronger. Again, as I pointed out, like muscles, you stress your muscles with strength training. And what do? At first they're sore and they get a little weaker for maybe the day or two, and then they start to regrow. They get stem cells, they get actual proliferation. So hormesis refers in general to the organism's capacity to regenerate and even get stronger. So instead of ending up even, if you challenge yourself a bit, you actually get stronger. And that is the major thesis behind trying to develop drugs or other vehicles, exercise, dietary restriction, to stress the organism in particular ways, and then to get a positive response backward that spreads not only to that part, that may not necessarily be limited. Muscle building, we know, does good things for the brain as well as for the biceps or the triceps or the quadriceps muscle. So that's hormesis. And in fact, it's true for plants and some of the good effects. Some people think that alcohol is a whole other topic, incidentally, but some people think that there's a hormetic effect from alcohol. I myself don't particularly believe it, but some people say that that's the reason that alcohol works. Makes you, there's some studies that some diseases are a little bit less, like cardiovascular might be a little less, some kinds of cancers might be a little bit more with alcohol. But whether or not alcohol is also stressing the body a bit, and you get some good results as well as some toxicity, it may depend upon how much you drink. And the evidence is that one drink maybe is good for you. More than one is probably begins to be bad for you. So is that hormesis? That's very much in debate. But that's a little about hormesis.
Another question is, can you talk a little bit more about what is bad about senescent cells?
Oh, yeah. Again, that's in my OLLI course. We don't have time for all that here. Senescent cells are cells that get shut down because there's something wrong with them. As we get older, their epigenome, for example, is screwed up, or they have a chromosome break, or they have something else that goes wrong in the replication of the chromosome, and it may turn into cancer. But the body has another, instead of turning into cancer, the body has another mechanism. It turns them into, it sort of hits the pause button on them. And they go into a state of not a special state in which they stop reproducing but don't die, a state of senescence. The problem with them is they also put out distress signals in the form of inflammatory cytokines, inflammatory proteins that signal the body to go in, to come and check them out. And the chronic inflammation produced by lots of senescent cells may give rise to a lot of the diseases, because another theory besides epigenetics of what goes wrong is chronic inflammation. And so chronic inflammation is part of what we now know about cardiovascular disease. We think it plays a role in Alzheimer's. It is true for almost every one of the chronically aging diseases are characterized by too much inflammation, and in fact, an overabundance of senescent cells in those organs. So the treatment, and one of the experimental treatment, it's far from prime time, is to take out, and it's only being done in animals at this point, is to target the senescent cells and kill them without causing cancer, obviously, just to take them out of their pause state and just knock them off so that they stop putting out inflammatory markers. And then they see in animals that the animals rejuvenate, look younger. So that's a whole promising line of inquiry of what can be done here. And these are serious scientists. Judy Campisi, who he mentioned, I've looked into her work, looks pretty good. And she's founded several companies. Again, I wouldn't invest in any of them. I think they're early on. But that's the whole area of senescent cells is big time. That's in the last 5 years, I'd say. That's really recent.
We have a question about chemotherapy, and it acts like it increases the aging process. Is there
Yeah.
anything anybody can do that has to undergo chemotherapy to reverse the detrimental effects and get back on track?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question about, what to do about the chemotherapy. First of all, I would advise having it. I mean, you worry about, if you got cancer and it's really spread and you need to prevent it. That's the first thing. I'd make sure that's going to kill you. You don't have to worry about getting old. So go with the treatment. Now, there's some interesting dietary things like fasting, and there's specialized kinds of diets that are fasting mimicking diets, which are a whole other topic. That may reverse some of the effects of chemotherapy, even while it's going on. It turns out there's something called the Warburg effect, in which cancer cells love glycogen or sugar. And if you can deprive cancer cells of sugar, which means depriving yourself of sugar because you just can't, to some degree, limiting your sugar, it turns out that cancer cells are particularly targeted by, it's its own kind of form of, if you will, a kind of systemic therapy. So there's some dietary things that you can do. There's some evidence also that people who exercise can reverse the effects of chemo to some degree.
Suffer from severe allergic reactions should not take this vaccine. There were 2 individuals.
Okay, so I guess that's not you. It's somebody in the background.
Right.
Okay, so whoever has the TV, the radio, or something. Thank you. Another question about. I think this is one that everybody wants to know. It's about caloric intake. And do we all have to get down to 80 pounds before we're going to be healthy?
No, if you're down to 80 pounds, you're probably not going to be healthy. Now, we're talking about just maintaining a reasonable weight. And if you're going to play with that, I'd think about more the issue of 1 day fasting periodically, or decreasing the time in which you're eating, so that you're not eating for 15 hours a day. There's some evidence, those less drastic. You don't want to mess with your total caloric intake very much if you want to just get down to normal weight. Besides, life isn't very worthwhile if you're going around starving. I mean, the quality of life ought to be taken into account, not just living another month. And remember, with all of these things, we're talking 10%, 15%. We're not. So how much are you going to suffer? Are you going to do self-induced suffering while you're healthy? Well, not me.
Well, that's all the questions that we have.
Good.
And I thank you so. Oh, here's another one. If got one more.
Last question. Right.
All right. Is body mass index an important marker relating to aging?
Yeah, you want to have a normal body BMI. I think it's usually 22 to 25, something like that. You can put in your height and weight into Google, look up BMI, put your height and weight in, and it'll give you a BMI, your body mass. That's important. We know that people who are obese don't live as long, and also get these same diseases. Particularly type 2 diabetes, but all of the others as well. So cardiovascular disease in particular. It's also just bad for your joints and mobility, so then you can't exercise. So a normal BMI would be a very good thing to shoot for, as best you can. If not, I'd talk with your doctor about if you can't exercise and you can't get your weight down. I know as a practicing psychiatrist, some of my patients who are on antipsychotic drugs and other medicines that I gave them caused weight gain, that I actually used to prescribe metformin for some of those people carefully. And in fact, it looked pretty good. That's not, it's not a medically approved condition, although a number of psychiatrists do that. It's again using metformin more as an anti-aging drug, but under careful circumstances. You don't want to block any of the other things you're doing. So it's good if you're not doing anything else. Possibly good.
So the saying about you can never be too rich or too thin, you've corrected us on the too thin part.
Absolutely. And I don't know about the too rich. Not a problem.
Thank you so much, Dr.
welcome.
Pomerantz. It was a fabulous presentation, and we look forward to the other ones. And in fact, there's a fifth one on the aging brain in January. So
Right.
we look forward to many, many more. And
Good.
for all of you that participated, thank you for coming.
Yes.
And
Thanks for the questions.
It was great. All right. Good night, everybody. Good evening. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.